Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game. With every conversation, we hope to inspire as many as possible to keep on Dungeon Mastering.
I'm one of your hosts, Dungeon Master Mitch.
And I'm your other host, DM Neal, aka Jote Maniac.
And today, Neal, as we jump into the meat, bigger is not always better. Today, I guess our motto is Yoda's motto that size matters not, because we're talking about tiny monsters today.
We are. We have a running document, and typically it's, we'll throw things out onto the Discord or wherever we can get it, whatever motivates us, and put it in there for the inevitable moment when we say, I don't know what we should talk about. Let's check this document. And then we digitally remove the dust, and then we saw tiny monsters, and we were motivated by that.
Yep. In text, you said, here's some things. And I said, tiny monsters sounds fun. And thus the episode. So I guess without any further ado, let's get into talking about tiny monsters. Let's get into the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
So usually because I am the one that opens that document, and inevitably we have that back and forth. And what we've realized is a really good question to ask is why, out of the several topics, because they are very different from each other, why did tiny monsters stand out as the one for this episode?
Yeah, I mean, when we started talking about this as a topic for the episode, I imagine whoever originally came up with the idea for this episode, that it came out of just that would be fun to discuss. And I don't know about you, Neal, but when I'm setting up for my D&D session and I'm thinking, oh yeah, and I like, this is all going to lead up to this big battle at the end. The big battle always, like, I'm always looking for the big minis that I've got scattered in my game room, right? It's like, okay, here comes the big boss, the difficult boss. I don't tend to go big battle, big stakes. Let's pull in the little monsters. And that's okay. Sometimes the little monsters, the tiny monsters, like, are good for the not boss battle. But yeah, I wanted us to talk about more like, how do we use tiny monsters maybe in a different way than they usually are used, or even just let's go more in depth in how to use tiny monsters well.
Yeah, I mean, I love that I can see a shelf behind you, and I can certainly, you can see, if you can see behind me, there's, I think,
plenty of D&D stuff.
There are 6 different large dragons you could choose. And behind you, I can see a Rancor, which immediately made me think yes. And then I told my brain, please stop. Let's focus back in, because I think it also, it can change those things, because if you think of that expectation of the Rancor-sized model dropping down with your minis in comparison, only to see what I hope we talk about a lot is the left hand of Manchu, which is just a single disembodied hand that has the powers of that wizard. So we're talking about 9th level spells. Yeah. And essentially your first introduction to that would just be this regular old hand. And you think back to, I believe, if history in my brain serves me, like, the first thing Ed Greenwood ever submitted was the crawling hand. And so maybe the assumption is it's only to find, again, 9th level spellcaster.
Yeah, you're right. There is something about dropping a large mini on the table that before you even roll for initiative, you can see the players be like, oh boy. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're talking about doing something a little different. And maybe that's something that's great about tiny monsters, is that your players may think that they're a piece of cake, but you can run tiny monsters well so that your players walk away, their characters bleeding and bloodied from the battle of these tiny monsters, and going, man, we underestimated those things.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity to then also, for you as the DM, think about different tactics, but also verbally really change things, because a lot of times it's on this big grand scale and you're talking about the dust and this, that, and the other. But with the small scale, I mean, there's some ways that it ends up being scarier, honestly, because of the things you have to say that are more realistic. Because, you know, I've never been in a large scale medieval battle, and I've certainly seen them. But if we're talking about things that could happen to an individual, there's something more tangible about that, because, you know, accidents and injuries that we have personally, again, now I can start to equate that better in my mind than again, the Rancor stomps on a person. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Okay. And then, you know, go to that next thing. Whereas, yeah, with the tiny creatures, it's terrifying.
So I guess one of the things that we should start off talking about is like, how do we run? And this will be most of, I think, what we talk about, but how to run tiny monsters. And the first thing that came to my mind is, because most of the time, not all the time, because I like theater of the mind, but most of the time when I have a planned battle set up, I'm using a map and minis. But there's a problem with a map and minis when it comes to tiny monsters. There aren't tiny monster minis. The small minis are pretty dang small. And so how do you use minis and maps when you are using tiny monsters? And if so, how do you do it? And if not, what's your alternative? What are your thoughts?
It's more accessible now than I think it's ever been before. Because one of our off-air discussions was just what a person can do in their own home these days compared to what you used to be able to do. You know, I don't have one, but I have a buddy who has one who's at my table. Like, I get things 3D printed. So now let's say it was wildly important. My players are not comfortable off the grid, and I just really needed it to get done. It's wild to me to think that I could get it done because I could upscale. Let's say, obviously, there's a dwarf warrior, dwarven fighter on the table. I could upscale him, and then at the same time, the tiny monster, I could downscale to like a 15 millimeter or 10 millimeter scale and still have minis. That's a lot of work. Like, don't get me wrong, but the fact that that is a tangible option that isn't out of reach is just mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you do want to stick to the map and the minis, you could use a substitute to the minis as well that's small enough and move them around. I'm even thinking about, like, there's those novelty, nobody ever uses them, really tiny dice that you could use, right? And if you have a bunch of those and they're just sitting in a bag, because why would you ever pull them out to use them in game? You just lose them. Those could be a good substitute for some tiny monsters. It comes down to, if you really want to use maps and minis, how creative do you want to get with it? Are tiny monsters going to be a theme in your campaign? Because you could create a map that's got bigger squares on it and use some action figures for your heroes of the campaign, put like a circular base on them, and then use regular minis to be the tiny creatures on this scaled up map. You could go that far. That's a lot of work. I would say don't do that for one single battle if it's going to be a continuation. But I don't know. I think for me, the easiest thing is get creative with Theater of the Mind and describe it that way. That for me would be probably the route that I would normally take when using tiny monsters.
Man, it's been a little while since I've got to drop the name of this game, so it makes me excited. But it makes me think of Phoenix Dawn Command, where it's deck building in a lot of ways. Your character sheet is basically a deck of cards that you're building through the campaign. You also have one that is representative of you, so the basic general where am I is my card is on the table. Let's say you're in front of me, then your card is in front of me, or you are to the side of me, your card is to the side of my card. So if you do generalizations, I think is also helpful if people need that touch point. But I agree. I think using the Theater of the Mind because of, I think when we're also going to get into tactics, I just also can't quite wrap my brain around some of the ideas I have in my head as to how I would even start to implement them on a gridded map. I genuinely don't know what I would do.
Yeah. So with this idea of you can use minis and maps, or you can just go straight to Theater of the Mind, which it sounds like that would be both of our leaning, but you can use minis and maps. And I guess it's up to you at home that you're listening to this, because I know there are some groups of players specifically that when they want battle, they want it in a mini and map form. So you might have to get a little creative with it. But let's start talking about the details of the battle then. The battling with tiny monsters, starting with something that I think is really important and can make the battle more intense, is thinking about the battlefield that's going to be utilized with tiny monsters.
Yeah, because it can definitely make a dungeon big when you're starting to figure out how many tiny monsters you can put in a regular dungeon.
Yeah.
Or you're outside.
Yeah.
And then it's just the possibilities are just absolutely limitless at that point, once you have tiny monsters, because, you had mentioned it. Basically, every blade of grass that's taller than they are is potentially cover.
Yeah, a beautiful grass, a beautiful field of tall golden grass suddenly becomes terrifying when there's creatures that are half the size of the grass that's grown, and they're running between your legs and trying to cut you to ribbons.
Makes me think of like a smaller version of Jurassic Park when you see the raptor trails going through.
Yeah, and I think with that, like that is a battlefield in my mind as a DM. I think I'd probably require some sort of perception check every time that a player is trying to make an attack against one of these creatures. Because if they're running around in full cover, not cover that would be able to stop a blow, but that they couldn't be seen. Like, you've kind of got to be watching where the grass moves and how the grass moves. And of course, there's going to be that one player, right, that goes, I'm going to just cast Fireball in this field. But
I also think with that, often once you're moving down to tiny, one, if they can't see them, giving disadvantage for sure, because one of the things is how many hit points does the tiny creature have. So part of it is just making them that much harder to hit without thinking of different ways that you're hitting them, because definitely disadvantage. I also think of evasion, because oftentimes they're way faster. So even though you did cast Fireball, it's not doing as much damage. They should be hard to hit. They're tiny.
Yeah,
that's just part of it.
Well, and Fireball is not going to be hopefully used if this is a setup encounter in which you've been hired by the city because there's a problem in the farms, the fields, and that's going to reduce the amount of pay that your PCs get because, well, they destroyed the fields that they're supposed to be trying to protect, right?
I also think of like just in this modern world, and it's certainly not the way to always think through things. Is certainly having touch points from our world that you bring into yours, but it can't be the end all be all. There's just magic, there's dragons, things don't exist, and always have to work 1-to-1. But I do think about that story from California, where I am from, where a gender reveal party turned into a tens of thousands acre fire.
Yeah.
So you choose to use Fireball, and you're telling me there's who to stop it? Unless it's you, like what mechanism is there in your world that would potentially stop what is now this raging fire?
Yeah, that field is now on fire, and then the house of the farmers who live there is now on fire, and that's probably not going to be the best way to solve the situation. If your players do it, they may have just caused bigger consequences. So tall grass is a great, I think, battlefield idea for using tiny creatures. They're just hidden. If we're talking about aquatic, you could use the same exact tactic with your players have to wade across a river, and it just goes up to their waists, but it is enough space for tiny aquatic creatures to be able to zip in and zip out below your waist and make attacks.
Yeah, the other one that just came to mind was the idea of giving these monsters layer actions. But the idea of their layer is just so much smaller. So it's like you're not getting that clue once you get within a mile, because, things are changing, it's this ancient dragon. So everything within a mile, it's a black dragon. So there's this swamp, these things. It's just you're crossing the river, and then all of a sudden, they're getting to do special things on initiative count 20 because you're in their lair.
Yeah, I was thinking also of, and you could certainly make this into a lair, but inside somewhere, whether it's inside a house or a castle or a dungeon, like you were talking about earlier. When I'm thinking about small creatures, we'll get more into tactics, but a hit and run tactic may very well be the type of attacks that small creatures, tiny creatures would use. And if you're inside somewhere, but there's little like mouse holes or whatever holes of creatures that this is going to be attacking you, that they can run into these holes and just go inside the walls of this house or go straight into another room. That could be a fantastic setting that can be used to an advantage by these tiny creatures.
I thought of a lot of different super fun things inside the dungeon. Are they able to get through like the grout between two bricks? So now they have their own holes and pathways that they can go through. Is it the floor? Is it the ceiling? Because changing that, either hitting from above or below, always a fun tactic. Because we're kind of trained to think in that more two-dimensional space because you are potentially looking at the grid so much. So thinking to look or up and down is not always the go-to. And just getting stabbed in the foot is definitely what I keep thinking.
Yeah, so I think we could go on and create and come up with all these different settings, but I think ultimately when you're creating ideas for battles with tiny creatures, the setting is a good place once you have the tiny creature selected to start with. How is this creature using their environment to their advantage? Let's dive more into like the tactics that tiny creatures would use, because I think it's going to be a lot different than dropping an ogre onto the battle map, which the ogre's most of the time going to, unless it's throwing rocks at your PCs, it's going to rush up to them and start wailing on them. And that might be a little different than how tiny creatures plan their attack. So what first comes to mind with tactics that tiny creatures would use?
I mean, I think really figuring out what intelligence level is of the creature is a really good start, because then the lower that goes, the more I would be prone to add more. So like I think of like the abyssal chicken from Descent into Avernus. Like one abyssal chicken, I think is a really good introduction to the fact that there are many, and then you're dealing with that sort of thing. But then if it's because in the same way, one that is really smart is just as good as a bunch that are not, in the sense that a quickling, it's like 120 foot movement speed. And what if that movement is through tunnels?
Yeah.
Untouchable. I'm just...
Yeah, or across water. That's because quicklings can run across water if it's too deep for the players to walk across. Even waiting slows them down, right? So, man, that quickling could just use an environment to its advantage.
Yeah, so I think that's probably the first and biggest thing is figuring out how intelligent I need to make them, because then I think that really sets the tone for just about anything else that's...
Yeah, how they fight. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think if you're talking about a dumb tiny creature, their tactic might be exactly what I stated that it wouldn't be, is the Russian attack, because they're not going to... some creature with an intelligence of 2 is not going to plan out their attack. They're probably attacking because you've entered into their territory and they're aggressive towards you. And so you're right. I think one of the best ways to make that into a encounter that's actually dangerous is if you have a low intelligence tiny creature, add more of them. Because if they are just going to run in and swarm you, then you need a bunch of them to make it actually a fight. But if they're smart, they can start thinking outside the box.
Yeah, I think of like the Vargul. I mean, let's see. There's a pronunciation guide. Let's try it. Varguil.
Okay.
I don't know.
You were off.
Matt Mercer said it with such confidence when I clicked on the button. But the idea that those could also be They could also be a second part of a battle. It's another thing that I've been thinking about. Like with those, you could have gone through all this battle and then those things come in and then, terrifying as it is, all the heads pop off of whatever you just fought. Wings pop out. And now,
oh man, I don't even know what episode it was, but it was on some episode we talked about some creature exploding like a spider, right? With the babies coming out like this. Yeah, this whole concept of yeah, terrifying.
or even that you could have something that is the first part is that it's all of these kind of grouped together, and then at one point they all separate, and now instead of one, now it's fighting every single person in your party.
Yeah.
Hey, calm down over there.
I think with intelligent tiny creatures, the first thing that I think that they would use to their advantage would be their size, as in stealth. Like they would want to get the jump on your PCs. They would have a surprise attack. They would use stealth attacks, perhaps, which is terrifying to think of that being used against your players, stealth attacks. Probably much less harmful since they're tiny creatures, but still giving them some sort of bonus to their attacks that are unseen. I even think of like tiny creatures when I think of tiny creatures in our own world that have to worry about predators. Well, they have a lot of them have camouflage that they can use to their advantage. Talking about like settings, if you're in a dark cave and you're fighting tiny creatures that have camouflage to look like the stone that is on the walls around the cave, and they can kind of hang off of those walls, that might be the exact thing that they use to attack your players as they start out and your players don't see the first wave of attacks coming. Creatures that look like stalactites or stalagmites that have that look to them, like ropers, but being really small versions of that. Now every stalactite and stalagmite is is dangerous and scary to your players because of these tiny creatures that have a stealthy way to attack.
I also think of having an exit strategy. I think it'd also be like a really prominent for the more intelligent ones, because knowing trying to gauge, okay, here's this whole party. I'm just one. I'm definitely going to try. But if I don't think it's going to work, then I'm just going to leave immediately without question. But yeah, having that. And then at that point, like, we hint at it some, and I know I don't do it all that well, but having a recurring thing, because it could just be that this, again, I think back to a quickling, that it just pesters them for a while until eventually they can figure out some way to stop it, trap it, do those sorts of things, and then have a discussion, probably at the end of a sword. But the idea of like having it be reoccurring because they can't figure out what to do.
Yeah, and I think you hit something on the head there when you said like the reoccurring, because I think adding some sort of, if you're homebrewing monsters, adding like a flyby attack, whether they're actually flying or not, but just the sense that the way that these tiny creatures attack is not running into the square next to your players and just attacking, but it's like a moving past and biting them or slashing them or cutting them as they continue to move and continue to get out of harm's way. And then you add 10 of the creatures that are doing that, and it's just like guerrilla warfare where it's like, get in, hit them, get out. That makes things a lot more difficult to fight against.
Yeah, because at that point you're, again, barring some sort of tactical change, the most you're getting is saving your reaction to hopefully maybe hit it with an opportunity attack. But even
yes.
that, because that's one.
And that's something that I might add for these monsters is take away the ability to opportunity attack them because of their tiny form, because of their speed. They don't take opportunity attacks, and that again makes things much more difficult. So your players aren't able to just every time a creature comes up to me, I'm able to just kill it with my opportunity attack once it tries to run.
Yeah, having stuff where like you said, like it's either always at disadvantage, or if creature has moved X amount of feet, then it just can't happen. Oh I just thought of like the idea of going through a dungeon and you think you stepped on like that classic arrow trap where it comes through the sides, only to find out that you just stepped into the wrong part and it's just actual monsters flying back and forth.
Yeah.
You're like, why are there so many traps in here? And you're just like, oh no, those are actually the thing you're supposed to fight.
I think of, like you said, the intelligence of a creature. If we're talking about intelligent tiny creatures, they are especially if they are knowledgeable about the dangers of adventurers and magic users, they're going to have the smarts to not cluster together, but to spread out for fear of one single fireball taking the entire group of them out, right? And so using that to the advantage of tiny creatures, I know as a DM and as a player, I've been involved in battles where I've had a bunch of little enemies grouped together and that battle is over in no time because the wizard casts Fireball. And if you would like your battle to be difficult, starting all your tiny creatures together, unless you're going to fudge something completely ridiculous, which we would say is probably not a good idea typically, you want to kind of spread these tiny creatures out so they don't just get wiped out. Or again, using Fireball, creating a different problem if they do that, like helps that situation, having there be consequences to that. But spreading out is, I think, a good idea for tiny creatures.
And stabbing them through the ground. Well, and also having those exits be something the players genuinely can't use. You do have to think through. There needs to be some win conditions that you're processing through with these tactics, because there's certainly a version of all these things that we've said where they just don't win. So, which obviously isn't probably the most fun for your players. But the idea of having it so that there are only like really a specific set of ways that they could win, because you really do need to cater to these tiny creatures because often their hit points are so low, be it like 10 to 20 usually, and their CR
maybe even lower.
Yeah, and their CR is pretty low as well.
Yeah, you might use minion tactics from 4th edition where they don't necessarily have hit points. It's whenever they actually get hit, they die because they're puny when it comes to taking damage.
Yeah. Or you can head over to our friends at MCDM and check out their, I don't think the book's out yet, but their stuff for minions is also really good.
I remember we talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Where one hit kills, but you leave the HP so that sleep isn't overpowered and things like that. But the other thing is also having it where your players just find out they aren't that easy to kill, which is always super fun.
Yeah. Who's to say that you can't have tiny creatures that have higher AC, higher HP, figure out why it is that they have that. But
yeah,
I love the idea of poison being used, or just even, poisons that cause a creature to be stunned or fall asleep, things along those lines. Because when I'm thinking about tiny creatures, I'm not typically going to have tiny creatures deal out large amounts of damage. You look at some tiny creatures from the monster manual and they just do a flat 1 point of damage, right? When they attack. Well, that's going to, unless you have a bunch of tiny creatures and lower level players, that is not going to be effective unless the creatures are trying to poison your players and the damage is going to be occurred through poisoning, or maybe these creatures don't want to kill your players, your PCs, but they want to poison them so that they fall asleep and steal their stuff. That in itself can be worse in some cases than, oh man, we lost a party member, all our stuff got stolen. Oh, that's rough.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that until now, but that's a really good idea. Is that the idea that they can physically do a lot of damage is tough, because almost all of the high CR ones are because they can cast spells. It's not because they can hit you really hard. So the idea of either adding spells or spell-like abilities or something that causes extra damage, which is always fun too, because then, there's a little bit more of that back and forth of, I roll a die and I inevitably say something like 1 to 4 piercing damage, give me a Constitution saving roll. And then it's 3d10 of poison damage or something like that. Or I even think of like smaller things that they throw or drop that's really funny to me. Like let's say they throw something and it's like, again, 1 point of bludgeoning damage. Give me a reflex save. And then and then just this explosion of let's say lightning or electricity or something like that. And then you're doing like 6 to 8d6 of lightning damage instead. And then it also is interesting because then your players are also thinking more about that. It's not that I'm necessarily going to avoid the hit, but what am I going to do about that second piece?
Yeah, and you brought up something that I was thinking about with tiny monsters, which is magic. And this is something that I had to kind of ask myself when I started a campaign of tiny heroes in my world, and we were using like squirrel folk and mouselings and that kind of like creature as the PC race. I had to ask myself, does size not matter with the magic? Like, does a pixie casting fireball cast the same fireball as a human casting fireball? And I think that's a good question when you're using tiny creatures to ask, because tiny creatures that are minion level, that one hit kills them, become way more scary if you have 10 of them that, yes, they can be killed super quick, but every single one of them has racial magic of magic missile. All of a sudden, they're a lot more scary and need to be dealt with a lot quicker. Because if magic is magic and it doesn't matter with the size, you can be a tiny little creature casting the same powerful magic, that makes those tiny creatures really scary.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like let's say we do draw that line, and I think back to just looking for weapon damage that's scaling your dice based on medium versus large versus small. That's one way we could go. We change all our d6s to 4s and we call it good. But the other thing I think is like, okay, but then like, is their wish less? Like, obviously, that's probably not how that would go. But yeah, it's also because they also become even scarier in their own society. The idea that their fireball is the normal full human sized fireball.
Yeah, it's basically a creature that has like a warhead that they can use at any time. Oh my god!
Or a lightning bolt, or just a regular old lightning bolt.
Yeah, do what I say, or I'm going to destroy the city. In 2 seconds.
One of the other examples is Traxigor, which I had forgotten about from Descent into Avernus, which is a polymorphed mage who's like a wise old man, and now is permanently, through a wish spell, a wise old otter. And it's just a tiny creature that can cast 9th level spells.
Yes, that's terrifying. That's terrifying, and also you thinking about introducing a little otter, and you don't have the drop the Tarask moment where it's like everybody's like, oh my gosh, but then all of a sudden it's using 9th level spells, and it's like, oh my gosh.
Well, yeah, because you just hear like this little tick, tick, because they have a cane. And then they come around the corner, and they can also cast Time Stop, the 9th level spell.
Oh my gosh. I want to be that character's friend
more
than anything else. But yeah, I mean, you could also, if we're talking about tiny creatures, not every creature in the battle needs to be tiny. You could have a tiny pixie riding something that's small or maybe even larger as war beasts, that you bring in some small and medium monsters into the battle, but ultimately they are just beasts of war or the mount of the tiny creatures, and there's more tiny creatures riding around. Just adds a little bit something different to the battle with the tiny creatures.
Yeah, I also think of them being this giant wave where they're the front line, and inevitably there's something behind it. Because I think of like the Gazer. Are there a bunch of those, and then you fight a beholder? But the idea that the air quote big again, we just go back to it's the left hand of Manchun. You get through these waves of ogres and all these things, and then just a hand comes out, only to find out that hand is what's been guiding the battle thus far, and then is again super powerful on top of that.
Yeah. I was thinking about swarms with tiny creatures, and we're not talking necessarily about swarms, but swarms are the idea of like you have a bunch of tiny creatures all together that create a medium size opponent, right? I do like the idea, if I was going to use tiny monsters a lot in battle, I like the idea of coming up with a way to have tiny monsters create a swarm and also disperse from a swarm. I think that would take a little bit of math with how much HP a swarm has and how much damage it does. Maybe you could create an easy chart for that. Again, sounding like a lot of work if it's going to be for one encounter, but if it was a monster that was going to be used multiple times, it would kind of be a cool thing to have creatures all join together to create a swarm and then swarm your player, doing more damage. Just an interesting tactic that tiny monsters could use.
Yep. Before, during, and after. Like they could, it could be this mass, and then they all get together, and then you do something, and then it all falls apart, and then there's definitely a lot that you could do. Again, especially because like it all depends on how much forethought you think went into the process. Is it, I think about it now, like we talked about the individual monster having that intelligence, but there's nothing to say that the person or creature or whatever behind that monster isn't the one that had the intelligence and is setting these things up to exist in a certain way. You could have it where the tiny monsters are flooding in and you make an arbitrary decision that it's 2 rounds, it's 3 rounds, whatever. The second you get to round 3, now enough of them have shown up and then they form Voltron. Then they form into something else. And then, the tactics need to change from there. But, that would be super fun. Having one and then a few more and then a few more. And then they come together to be something different.
Yeah. And that could also create a different style to the battle, that it creates this time sensitive nature of, if you don't kill these things quicker, mm-hmm. the swarm will get bigger, and the swarm being this like last level of that battle, how difficult it's going to be is going to depend on how quickly you can kill the small creatures that are swarming in to create this, right?
So the one thing it made me think of, and I only really played the earlier games in this series, but it makes me think of the flood from Halo.
Yeah,
because if you're not quick enough when the little
there goes that bit of homework, Neal.
Yeah. Well, never mind. Cut that out.
Keep going.
No, but because if you don't kill them fast enough, they literally go into other creatures, and then that creature gets back up, and now you got to deal with that again.
Yeah.
So that's it just dawned on me.
The last tactic piece that I thought of with tiny monsters, that this one completely terrifies me, is the idea of a creature being small enough that they could get under the armor or clothes of a PC. And if that's like a tactic and a ability that a creature has, like how do you then kill it? Do you have to hit yourself and cause yourself damage to kill the creature? And does it do more damage if it continues to remain under your clothing, under your armor, biting your skin directly, whatever it is? I can just imagine the reaction of my players when I tell them that creature that is next to them, for them to roll a dex save, and when they fail it, the small gremlin crawls up their pants leg, just like freaking out at what's going to happen now. Yeah, terrifying in my mind.
And then later it bursts out of their chest.
I mean, depending on what type of creature you're making, that could certainly be a disturbing feature of certain monsters, is laying eggs, infecting. Yeah.
Okay. We started to get into it because I've ripped off the Band-Aid so we can head to homework so that we can throw out other ideas like Halo and the Flood.
Yes. So one of the first things that I thought of was there's some really great 80s and 90s movies that you could go to. Okay, so we're talking about tiny monsters, and at least for this first one, they would be, I think, small category. But I immediately thought of Gremlins as a bit of a fun movie that could give you some ideas of how small creatures to tiny creatures can be terrifying, especially when there's a lot of them. And also there's the lesser known and less good, but still something that's worth a watch. Critters movie, at least the first one. I haven't seen all of them. I think there's like 5. But kind of get that 80s vibe of small creatures that can create a huge problem. I'm also going to say that another piece of homework for this would be watching season 1 of Peacemaker. And if you don't want spoilers, skip ahead for a minute while I talk about it. So I'll let you skip ahead now. But in Peacemaker, you have these tiny little alien creatures that have this ability to take over the body of humans and inject themselves into the brain of the humans. And to me, kind of along with the crawling up the clothes, like Neal, you were pointing towards like Alien, that to me is a terrifying feature of a tiny creature that you could use in your games. So watch that if you haven't watched it.
Yeah, what I think about is it's a comic called Scurry, where it's basically about mice, and I think that just in general, like it's another helpful way to figure out tactics or things like that. It's just you're observing from that perspective of the world is just this bigger place. So the things that they can and can't do or choose to do, because then it can have you come up with really cool ideas of ways that you could, like you said, really, I guess the whole thing is just how can you mess with your players with tiny monsters? But like I said, just different tactics. So like, and the art style is really, really good on that one. So yeah, Mac Smith Scurry. And yeah, like we said, Halo. I'm trying to think of other ones that are really small and terrifying.
I just remembered a scene in the movie. Sorry, I haven't read the comics of the movie Wanted, where you have this character that uses rats and he uses rats that have like bombs attached to them.
Yep.
And talk about a way that you can create a terrifying situation with tiny creatures, tiny monsters, having them have an explosive attribute to them that could make a situation scary.
The other one I thought of is, and this is probably too small now that I think of it. So, but again, you're trying to reframe that perspective. But a good old classic.
It's never too small. Tiny means smaller than small, and it keeps on going, right?
It is the bottom, so it's everything. Okay, so then obviously the Honey, I Shrunk the Kid series, again, to get that perspective, and be terrified by that ant. I don't know if there's any other ones. No, I mean the ones that ends up being dolls for some reason, like that's just not like that doesn't hit my sensibilities in a scary way. From a kid to this age, I'm always just like, kick it. I don't know.
Oh, see, I'm one of the people that find those porcelain dolls to be extremely creepy. So you throw a bunch of porcelain dolls like that are like floating in the air, acting like a demi-lich, the floating skull, like just replace it with floating doll. Oh yeah, I'm freaked out by it.
No, even as a little kid, I was like, "Yo, why is Chucky killing you? Just please kick him. Just kick him." But I will end on this because I was trying to see if there was any other ones I could find real quick on the internet. And obviously, you need to go watch Small Soldiers.
I do like that movie. Talking about the 90s.
Mm-hmm. I just want to take a minute to thank Mitch for coming on and talking about. So, if you want to get,
thanks. I hope you'll have me back.
Maybe. But if you wanted to, I lost it. If you wanted to get a hold of us and tell us how you've been using tiny monsters in your campaign, you can always email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And of course, if you like this episode or any of the others and you see fit, head over to your podcatcher of choice and leave us a rating and review, because some don't even let you do it. But it always helps us out a little bit each time someone does. A Dungeon Master gets their dice. There you go.
Follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. Or like our Facebook page for updates about the show. The Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out our other shows like Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, Detentions and Dragons, Geek Wars, and more.
As always, thank you for listening to the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the ego of everyone else at the table. I'm DM Neal. Good night and good luck.
And I'm DM Mitch, reminding you to always keep on dungeon mastering.
not inspiration, it's not wisdom, and it's bad advice.
So if you really want to get your players to understand it, throw bugs at them. Just at the table. Tiny monsters. Bugs.
Goodbye.